Hi everybody, welcome back to Between the Lines. My name is Julian, I'm an obsessive reader and used book collector, and holy shit, this book So this is my review of the fourth book in the Wheel of Time series, The Shadow Rising. I'm going through the books for the first time. I started reading them in preparation for the show coming out and have continued the series since starting The Eye of the World in November. Just like my other reviews, this is going to start off with a spoiler-free section where I'll talk about my general thoughts and feelings towards The Shadow Rising, but will include spoilers for books 1 to 3 and everything that has led up to book 4. But later on in the video, I'll put up a spoiler tag when I will be talking spoilers for book 4 and all the crazy, insane stuff that happens in this entry into the Wheel of Time. And later on in the spoiler section, I'm going to talk some predictions that I have for the next book and for the remainder of the series. A viewer actually pointed out that it'd be a cool idea to start doing those in my Wheel of Time reviews, so I'm going to include that a bit later on, but keep it within the spoiler section because there's a lot that happens in this book that's going to inform my predictions for future entries. So book 4, The Shadow Rising, before I get into my actual spoiler-free review, just going to give a quick synopsis on what's going on here and how things are picking up after book 3. So after taking Kalendor in the Heart of the Stone, in Tyr, Randall Thor has kind of fulfilled one of the big prophecies of being the Dragon Reborn, and I'm pretty sure has finally accepted his role as the Dragon Reborn. He spent a lot of time not really accepting that over the first 3 books, and I'm happy that finally here he's just kind of going with it. And our main cast of characters are all together in Tyr, and after some unusual things start happening in the Stone of Tyr and some rumors about things going on in the wider world, our party splits up yet again to pursue another adventure, and that's as far as I'm going to talk about the actual plot, because so much that happens here is character driven and focused on their decisions and leads into really deep spoiler territory, but that's the general setup of this book. So what did I think? Well, if you saw the first 5 seconds of this video, I think you know how I feel. This book was incredible. I'm not gonna lie, there was so much hype for this one. Everyone's talked about how The Shadow Rising is one of the best, if not the best, Wheel of Time books, and I totally get why now. This book, I feel like when Robert Jordan was writing it, kind of took all maybe the bad feedback he was getting from the first 3 books and the things that were maybe annoying people and changed them and fit them into the story in a way where it actually suited the purpose of what was going on in the story. And all the gripes I had, especially with book 3 that I was pretty mixed on, were fixed here. Things like bad communication between characters. I mean, there's still a lot of bad communication between all these young idiots, but here it serves a purpose and characters are more quick to learn their mistakes and kind of accept what's going on and move on with it, instead of like pulling a Hamlet for the entirety of a 1,000-page book and wondering whether or not they should do something or accept something. I found this book also had a tight focus that was part of the reason why I liked the first 2 books a lot. There was a goal the characters went about trying to achieve that goal or getting to a certain location. Especially book 2, that book was laser focused on a goal for our characters. Book 3, there was a lot of meandering and it wasn't as focused and tight, but this book, I'd say after maybe the first 100 pages, those first little things in the early acts of this book had a few of those problems from book 3 that carried over. Just a lot of kind of meandering and waffling on things and not a lot of drive. But once the plot just kind of kicked in, it went straight to 100 and never stopped from there. It was so laser focused on what the characters had to do, and I love that. And this is probably the highest the stakes have been since the first book. I really like how, of course, in setting up the story, the whole world was thrust upon you and there's so much you had to learn, and it was life or death, and the entire world rested on what these characters had to accomplish. And I feel like in this book it kind of went to those high stakes again. Not to say that books 2 and 3 didn't have high stakes, of course they did, but this one felt like the whole world again was being shaken by the events and the decisions of our characters. And I thought the mysteries in this book were a bit more compelling than they have been in the past. The mysteries here were very intriguing, and many of the mysteries that were set up in this book were finally resolved, including stuff from all the way back in book 1. We kind of get answers to as why those things are, why they exist, and how it's going to inform the story moving forward, which is something I found immensely satisfying. And something I appreciated so much about this book was how much better the villains and antagonists were written. That was a huge kind of downside for book 3, especially for me, and a bit of book 2, were how silly and incompetent the antagonists were. But I feel like Robert Jordan kind of caught on to that at this book, and we're realizing, oh, I'm kind of doing the same thing over and over again, where all our characters are just killing Trollocs without much problem, even killing Fades without much problem, or encountering characters as high stakes as a Forsaken and just wiping them out in 2 pages. Here I feel like there was a shift from just, you know, the bad guys attacking and then getting defeated to more of thinking about the internal struggle of the characters and how they're going to overcome their obstacles, giving some more depth to the antagonists and having them out in the open and directly confronting our heroes. And it's not much of a spoiler to say that the Forsaken do make appearances in this book as they have in the previous 3. And in this one, they aren't total clowns. They're actually pretty effective and there's a bit more depth to them. And they aren't just one and done. I feel like going forward, we're going to see a bit more of these characters and a bit more interest and compelling storytelling to go along with them. And something that happened while I was reading this book, I think, is that it finally clicked for me what the series was about and what was really going on here. It's like that moment, if you've ever played a Souls game, a FromSoft game, where you kind of get what the game is doing and it clicks for you and then it stops becoming so insanely difficult. It was like that for this book, where I kind of understood, okay, this is what Robert Jordan's doing. He's showing how real people would react and drive these events if something like this was going to happen. If a random farm boy became the chosen one, the dragon reborn, and had the fate of the world thrust on his shoulders, how would a realistic person act in that case? If you found out you can talk to wolves and had all these dream powers, how would a normal person who's never left their village for the first 20 years of their life react to that? And so when I was getting frustrated with these characters for not accepting these things and moving on with them as characters in other books would, where they just kind of get superpowers and go along with it, I think the way that they're reasonably reacting to these things and kind of pulling a Hamlet where they're not sure how to act or accept things is very realistic, and I can't imagine how I would react in a situation like that. So it's really made me come to appreciate something that I didn't necessarily like in the previous books, but the way it's handled here made it clear to me that this is what's actually happening in this story. And speaking of Rand, I'm happy we get a bit more time with him in this book. In The Dragon Reborn, we were barely in Rand's perspective, and the little we saw of him, he seemed to be going very off kilter, and we maybe started to think that the madness of male channeling was happening to him. But in this one, he's a bit more chilled out. Right from the beginning, we see he's calmed down a bit from his situation in book 3, and spending that much more time with him and in his perspective was very refreshing, although I thought it was pretty effective to kind of handle the point of view the way it was in book 3. Being with Rand again as sort of the main character, the driving protagonist of the series, was something I appreciated a lot, and seeing his growth especially, and something I always talk about how much I love in all of these reviews. The world, the cultures, the people. Robert Jordan has to be one of the best people I've read in a book at developing a world, at world building, at drawing up new characters with such rich histories and backstories, but in a way where it doesn't feel like reading a history textbook or just an information dump. Everything feels so organic to the people and the characters and how it influences the story, and he's able to accomplish it so quickly. There's a culture in this book, I won't say who, but we maybe spend 5 pages with them, and they are so well fleshed out and so intriguing. I wanted to learn so much more about them, and I can't wait to encounter them again, because in so few pages, Robert Jordan was like, this is who they are, this is what they're about, here you go. And I'm like, okay, please give me more of that. This is amazing. And speaking of cultures, we have the Aiel. These guys are the freaking coolest. I absolutely love the Aiel. They're such an interesting culture and people, and the way they come off the page and integrate into the story is so awesome. At the end of book 3, we had a contingent of Aiel that was at the Stone of Tyr, now following Rand, and we discover at the end of book 3 that they're called the People of the Dragon, which was part of the prophecy, and we learn plenty more about their culture in this book. Their traditions, their history, their divisions within their own culture, and the different clans and septs is all so interesting, and the way they draw inspiration from so many different of our own real world cultures in a way that makes them feel fresh and unique, but having some recognizable traits where we can empathize with them as well. It's just so well done, and I can't wait to spend more time with the Aiel. So that's it for my spoiler-free thoughts for The Shadow Rising, book 4 in the Wheel of Time. If you can't tell, I absolutely love this book, and if you haven't read it, if you stopped at book 3, I would very much recommend continuing. When I finished The Dragon Reborn, I wasn't the most thrilled to get into the next one. I really liked the first 2 books, and I was excited to get into book 3, but I was pretty mixed on book 3, and I was like, I'm not gonna get into book 4 anytime soon. There's no rush. I'm not in an eager mood to start the next book, but as of right now, I really want to read book 5, but I know if I start it, I'm gonna get burnt out on the Wheel of Time, so I gotta take a little break, despite wanting to read it so bad. And when the mood comes up again, maybe in a month from now, I'll start The Fires of Heaven, book 5. So I'm gonna start talking spoilers now. If you haven't read the book, I'd warn you that you're gonna get spoiled on pretty much everything that happens in The Shadow Rising. And so continue on if you've read the book and want to hear my spoiler thoughts, or just don't care, you're welcome to come along as well. But if you don't want to watch this part, skip to the time I put on below. Something I really appreciated about this book was how it starts breaking the formula. In books 1 to 3, we had a kind of very straightforward formula. We have our prologue, our characters just chilling around in a comfortable situation in Act 1, then a Trolloc attack, then they go on a journey, they split up, things happen, they learn a bit about themselves, they don't accept those things about themselves, they all meet up at the end, face the final conflict together, usually with the Forsaken. Moiraine has a wrap-up chapter where she gives us a lot of world information and backstory and informs us a bit about Rand's next big channeling thing that he just did, and we move on to the next entry into the series. And while there are plenty of elements of that in this book, I feel like it broke that formula a little and is going to start becoming its own thing. We of course have the prologue, which wasn't called a prologue confusingly in this book. I think in the first 3 they were all called prologue. The Act 1 of just chilling in the Stone of Tear, the Trolloc and Fate attack, the characters splitting up and going their own ways, but from there on it becomes a very different book from the others. And while at the end there's a conflict between Rand doing a big new channeling thing and a Forsaken, he doesn't kill the Forsaken, or the Forsaken that's involved in that doesn't die, and there's so much more development that's going to come from that, and I'm so eager to find out what's going to happen from there. And there's no real Moiraine wrap-up chapter. The characters are all still separate at the end on their own adventures, with a bit of wrap-up to give it a sense of closure at the end of the book, but enough to lead you into the next one where you're like, okay, what's going to happen next? So I really appreciated that aspect of it. But now let's get into the different storylines and what I really liked or maybe didn't like about each of those. So let's talk my favorite storyline of this book, and that's Perrin's arc. I absolutely adore this story. It started off pretty slow for me and pretty frustrating at the beginning, where Perrin and Faile especially were pulling a lot of kind of the bullshit from earlier books where they were being annoying to each other and not learning and just not being mature about things, especially Faile, who is emotionally and physically abusing Perrin. But by the time they kind of get to the Two Rivers and that story starts picking up and Lord Perrin, Golden Eyes emerges, that whole thing was absolutely just a beautiful story, and it affected me so strongly that I actually cried during one of the scenes. I don't cry when I read books, but this scene got to me. It was nuts. By the time we get to later on in that storyline, Perrin and Faile I turned on them a little. I started valuing them and feeling good about their relationship. Not a whole lot, but certainly better than I did at the beginning of the book. And by the time the wedding came around, I was like, okay, I kind of like these kids. I hope they do well. And that marriage scene reminded me a lot of Braveheart. And I was just like, okay, like this is some good stuff. I'm with this. But the moment that actually kind of just got me to start crying like a little baby is one that happened a little after that. And there's a couple of things that if I see it in a story, a movie or whatever, that will just instantly gut me right here and go like, ooh. One of those is when people are facing imminent doom and know they're about to die, and they share just a last moment of humanity together, and it's so sad but kind of warming at the same time. Another thing that gets me is when someone pulls a Han Solo moment and they come to save the day, but it works in a way where it suits their character arc. It's not like a person who just shows up to save the day. That's fine. That happens in movies. Sometimes it happens poorly with a lot of Deus Ex Machina stuff. But when Han Solo in Star Wars leaves to go continue his smuggling and being a handsome rogue, comes back to save Luke, something like that will also just get to me right here. And the third thing that will set me off is when people band together and they just put their differences aside and join together to fight off evil. And in this moment, all three of those things happened. It's during the Battle of the Two Rivers when we feel like all is lost, they're getting overrun, the Trollocs have broken into the village, and then Faile, who we think left to go bring a message to Caemlyn, came back with people from Watch Hill, and the people from Devon Ride show up, and one of them is flying the Manetheren flag. And as soon as I read that Faile was back, I went, oh no. And then I just lost it. I had to put the book down, and I was listening to this music that suited the scene so perfectly, and I was like, oh shit, this is really happening. And then to follow that up, like, a couple pages later, Perrin finds out that one of his cousins is still alive after his whole family was killed, was just like, that was a gut punch and a half. So all that really got me. Perrin's story arc, the Battle of the Two Rivers, coming back home for the first time since the Eye of the World, was my favorite aspect of this book. Another storyline I enjoyed, well, I enjoyed all of them, but Elaine and Nynaeve going to Tanchico with Tom and Julian, whose name is not Julian as I really wanted it to be because he's a cool kind of private detective character, which I love in a story, but it's Julian. I really like seeing these characters step up and grow into themselves a bit more, especially Nynaeve, who's been kind of grating, a little abrasive character in the past, and you know, that's not necessarily a knock on the writing, that's just how this person is. And like I said before, he's writing real people here in these situations, so I can't really knock him for that. But seeing them start to level up and grow in their powers and kind of take on a more leadership role, because these characters haven't been in too much of leadership positions since maybe they were in the past. You know, Elaine was the daughter heir, so of course she had to show some leadership, and Nynaeve being the wisdom. But since then, since becoming Aes Sedai, they haven't really stepped into that role as much as some other characters, and I liked seeing that here, especially Nynaeve fighting Moghedien and winning, which I realize now the Forsaken are just incompetent, but they're just people like you or me. They're not these crazy godlike beings that maybe the stories have built them up to be. And to see that level of humanity in them is something I'm starting to value more as these stories go along. And from Elaine's perspective, we get a lot of her POV in this story. I liked seeing how she thinks of things through a lens of being a leader or royalty, seeing how being a head of state kind of influences, or a future head of state, I should say, influences your decisions and how you view social interactions and kind of how you are just kind of interacting with the world. And I also really like the scene where she got super wine drunk. I thought that was hilarious. I enjoyed it a lot. And the way Robert Jordan wrote being drunk, I thought was so spot on, and I just couldn't stop laughing during that scene. Now let's talk about Rand. This is a big part of this book, Rand's journey into the Aiel Waste, becoming the clan chief of all the clan chiefs and getting the dragon tattoos on his hand, which is something I've seen in pictures before starting the series, and I was excited to see that finally being fulfilled, along with Matt's kind of staff sword thing and his hat. We finally get the answers to most of Rand's family history. It's very heavily implied here that Rand's parentage is Tigraine, the former queen or daughter heir of Andor before Morgase, and Janduin, who's an Aielman, who I think was the clan chief of the Tardad. And this is something that was unfortunately spoiled for me because of the TV show. I was watching, I think episode 7, whatever episode of the Wheel of Time show it was, where we see the Aiel War on the slopes of Dragonmount, and I pressed pause to go get a drink, and of course it said the cast member's name on the x-ray thing, playing Tigraine, and I was like, I guess I found out who Rand's mom is. But getting that confirmation here was nice, and hearing that there's kind of more to that story than I just got in that spoiler, where Guitarra Moroso, the Aes Sedai who told Moraine and Swan about the prophecies of the dragon, him being born on the slopes of Dragonmount at that moment, was the one who told Tigraine to go to the Aiel Waste, and setting all that up I thought was really cool. And the way Rand's father ended up going to the Blight and was killed by someone who looked like Tigraine, I think is really interesting, and we get a bit of hints of that whole story in this book as well. I also really enjoyed here Rand stepping up. In book 3 he was all over the place and so unpredictable and dangerous, but in this book here we get a lot of Rand just accepting he's the Dragon Reborn. This is what he has to do. I mean, he took Kalandor out of the Heart of the Stone. He's pretty clearly the Dragon Reborn, and he accepts that and now has to keep going with it. And I really liked the way he handled things and took a lot of agency in his actions and drove the story forward. And his fight at the end with Asmodean was really, really cool from an action perspective as well as a story perspective, and the way they destroyed Ruidian, and the fallout of that, not just wiping out the Forsaken like Moraine did with Belal in book 3, which I thought was super underwhelming. Here, defeating Asmodean, but then saying, okay, you have to teach me now how to channel. I am super stoked about and can't wait to see how this mentor teacher-student relationship is going to develop between Rand and a Forsaken, and trying to keep the fact that he's a former Forsaken under wraps from Moraine. I think that's going to be a lot of fun to see. And I liked Lanfear in this book so much more. She wasn't being super unsneaky Celine again. She's like, hey, guess what? I'm Lanfear. I want you back. You're going to be mine. And then there's all this conflict between them. And of course, she tries to be unsneaky Keely later on, where we're like, okay, one of these people is definitely Lanfear being up to her nonsense again. But even Rand called them on that bullshit and was super onto them. So I liked that more than the way it was handled in The Great Hunt. And I thought it was kind of funny as well. So all in all, I think I like the way the Forsaken were handled in this book way more than the other ones. Moghedien, who's not the strongest physically, was kind of dismantled by Nynaeve, but not stilled. For a second there, I thought she was stilled, but that appears to not be the case going forward. And as Modian, that fight, he was so awesome. The stakes felt really high during his battle with Rand. It was so cool. And then the way that was wrapped up, and going forward, I hope we get some more development on this character and see more of what he's all about. Oh, and how could I not mention one of the biggest plot lines in this story? Not from a page count perspective, but from just an implications and world perspective, is the fall of the White Tower. Holy shit, I did not see that coming in this book, and especially the way that chapter started, where the Amerlin seat was just kind of looking through papers on her desk, leading to a coup, and all this stuff happening was just insane. I'm like, holy shit, what is going on? This is awesome. There are so many big implications for what's going to happen in the future of the Aes Sedai in this, and to see such a powerful person being deposed, I was like, okay, I cannot wait to see how this is going to progress going forward. When Moiraine finds out, when Rand finds out, when the girls, Egwene, Nynaeve, and Elaine find out, there's a lot riding on this, and holy shit, I can't wait to read book 5. And we have Logain with them too, who Min saw is going to have future glory. I want to know what's going to happen so bad. Logain is such an interesting character, and I want to spend more time with him and see how this power and glory is going to come about. But also, Gawain. That guy sucks. Alright, so before we wrap up, let's get into the predictions I have. I'm going to start predicting things that I think might happen in book 5 or just in the future in the series. So based on what I know in books 1 to 4, these are my predictions for the future of the Wheel of Time. I think Moiraine is going to die, and die pretty soon. This is a character who we haven't spent a whole lot of time in their perspective. I feel like I want a little more of Moiraine and more time with Lan, who is one of my favorite characters. They seem so crucial to this story at large, and we haven't spent as much time with them as I thought we might have, considering how important their role was in the beginning of this story. And since book 2, I believe Moraine's been kind of teasing to Lan that she knows she's gonna die eventually, maybe even pretty soon, and talking about getting him bonded to a different Aes Sedai and all that stuff. And the fact that Nynaeve and Lan have this relationship and they're in love with each other makes me think that eventually Moiraine is gonna die, Lan is gonna become Nynaeve's warder, and the fact that all this stuff is going on with the White Tower and the Amerlin seat being deposed, who's kind of Moraine's BFF, all that is tying in together. And I also think that since you're supposed to read the prequel New Spring after book 5, The Fires of Heaven, which the prequel I believe takes a focus on Moiraine and Lan, that maybe in book 5 Moiraine is gonna die. Another thing I think is going to happen, and this is maybe not in book 5, but we'll see, is that Perrin is going to have to meet Fael's family. She is royalty. She is the cousin of the Queen of Saldea, and Perrin is just this blacksmith from the Two Rivers. I mean, he's Lord Perrin now of the Two Rivers, but at the same time, he's this random dude. Fael ran away from her royal home to go on these adventures, and she's gonna come back with this blacksmith husband who is a lord of the Two Rivers and has golden eyes and can talk to wolves. I think that's gonna be a pretty funny meet the Perrin situation, but we'll see if that actually plays out the way I think it might. And this is something that I think Varen teased as well. She said to Perrin at one point, like, do you know what you got into marrying Zareen Bashir? And he's like, I don't know, we'll see. I also think we're gonna deal with the Caemlyn situation soon. Since book 3, we know that Morghese is kind of under the influence of one of the Forsaken, which I believe in this book was confirmed to be Ravin. I think Elaine is going to be involved in the story going forward. I think she's going to end up in Caemlyn and kind of have to figure out the situation and eventually become queen of Caemlyn. We also have Padan Fain, or Deeth, whatever you want to call him, going to Caemlyn on his way to Tar Valon to pick up the dagger, which he claims is his. We also have Elaida, who was the former Aes Sedai in the court of Caemlyn to Morghese, who's now the Amerlin seat, and Tar Valon isn't that far from the city, so I think that's all going to kind of converge there, and we'll get some sort of conclusion about that Maybe in book 5, maybe a bit after, but I think soon-ish. We also have Tom and Elaine getting closer and a bit more development on their history, having known each other when Tom was Morghase's boyfriend and Elaine was a baby there. So I think that's all gonna factor in as well. And we also have Gawain, and also Gawain, he sucks, who is the head of the younglings, which I think is hilarious, having seen, Revenge of the Sith and knowing what happens to the younglings there. That's bad, I shouldn't joke about that. And we also know now that Rand was Tigraine's son, who was the queen or daughter heir, I can't remember, of Andor before Morghase. And Elida was told, or she had a foretelling or something like that, that the future was resting on the royal line of Andor. So I think that's all gonna come in together and factor into this Caemlyn situation. And my last prediction, I think Bail Dahlman is gonna encounter the Seanchan again. He's going out to the islands to dispose of that necklace and bracelet that's supposed to be able to control Rand. And we know from the first chapter in The Shadow Rising that the Seanchan are still out there in one of the islands. So I think a couple things might happen. He might drop the thing in the bottom of the ocean like he's supposed to and then get captured by the Seanchan, or the Seanchan might capture him and take the bracelet as well and figure out that they can control men with these bracelets and necklaces as well, which is a terrifying implication, but we'll see where it goes. But hopefully whatever happens there, I hope Eggy Annan is involved because I really liked her character. I thought she was really cool, and getting in the perspective of someone from Seanchan was really interesting. So that's it. That's my review of The Shadow Rising. This was a long one and I talked a lot about this book, but I absolutely loved it. It was a huge book. It took me a couple weeks to read, but I enjoyed every second of it and I cannot wait to get into book 5. So let me know your thoughts. Have you read The Shadow Rising? And if you have, did you like it as much as me, or were you a bit more mixed on it? I know Wheel of Time isn't everyone's favorite and there's stuff in here that I can totally understand why people wouldn't like. So if you didn't, let me know why. So before you go, remember to do all the YouTube stuff like liking and subscribing. It always helps out and I really appreciate it. And as always, thank you for watching. Please remember to support your local library and I'll see you next time.